So right now here at Zion over the course of the summer, we're walking through and working through a book of the Bible. We're actually walking through and working through the first book of the Bible, which is the book of Genesis. And just in case you're new here, you're a guest here, it's your first time back in a long time, let me kind of give you a lay of the land of what this book is kind of all about. One of the fascinating features of the book of Genesis is that it's full of a bunch of very famous stories. We got the one about Adam and Eve and the forbidden fruit. That's in the book of Genesis. We got the one about Noah and the ark and the big flood. That's in the book of Genesis. Even if you don't study the Bible a lot, even if you don't come to church a lot, even if you would say that you don't know a lot about the Bible, my guess is somewhere along the way, you've heard these stories before, because just culturally, these are very famous stories that we tell. But what we're discovering in this series is that the book of Genesis really is not just a collection of stories that we tell. At its heart and at its root and at its core, the book of Genesis is meant to be a collection of stories that actually tell us. The book of Genesis is meant to be a collection of stories that tell us things about God and about life and about faith and about hope. At the core of the book of Genesis is meant to be a book of stories that tell us about what matters most in life. And so kind of the big overarching question of this series is this: what can this book of stories that we tell us? Because this book of stories has a lot that it wants to tell us. And so today, as we continue through our series, we're going to be taking a look at another pretty famous story about a couple of really famous, or kind of infamous, as the case may be, cities. One which is named Sodom, that's one city, and the other city which is named Gomorrah. Now, here's the thing, even in our day and age, cities tend to be famous for certain things. For example, if you go to the city of New York, they have a slogan: New York is the city that never what? Never sleeps. There's always something going on in New York. There's hustle and bustle all the time. It's going 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Or if you head west and you go to Vegas, they'll make you a promise, and the promise is this: what happens in Vegas does what in Vegas? It stays in Vegas, because Vegas can be just a little wild, and sometimes what you did in Vegas, you don't want it making it out of Vegas, right? Or how about this? If you just go a few miles south down I-35 to the town that's just south of Wahlberg, Austin, they will say you want to keep Austin what? Because it's known for being, well, weird, kind of eclectic, right? Kind of unorthodox. They always break the mold in Austin. Or let's say you go way up north to Cleveland, all right? Cleveland, Ohio, just south of Lake Erie. They will talk about Cleveland like this. They will call it the what by the lake. Anybody know? Yeah, I cannot believe that people know this at both services, but that's real. Believe it or not, it's real. And if you don't believe me, you can Google it. It's not nice, but it's real. Here's the thing: cities are known for certain things. In the Bible, in Genesis, Sodom and Gomorrah were known for just one thing. They were known for their sin. Sodom and Gomorrah were famous for their sinfulness, their rebellion, their debauchery, their depravity, their defiance against morality. In fact, here's how famous Sodom and Gomorrah were for their sin. You fast forward 1,500 years after Sodom and Gomorrah no longer existed. And there was this Old Testament prophet, his name was Ezekiel. Ezekiel 16, beginning at verse 49, Ezekiel is talking about the city of Sodom. And 1,500 years after the city of Sodom was gone, this is what Ezekiel says about Sodom. This was the sin of Sodom. Because even 1,500 years after the city was gone, Sodom was still famous for its sin. She and her daughters were arrogant, they were overfed, they were unconcerned, they did not help the poor and the needy, they were haughty, and they did detestable things. And I actually want you to pick up on the little phrase, detestable things. This is a biblical idiom, because the sin that Sodom and Gomorrah were probably most famous for was their sexual sin, and that phrase, detestable things, refers to that kind of sin. Sodom and Gomorrah, two cities famous for just one thing: their sin. Now, it's all of this that takes us to the story from Genesis that we're going to be looking at today. Because in Genesis chapter 18, God has been looking down on the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah for a long time, and God doesn't like what he sees. God doesn't like the sin they've been committing. And so what God does is he comes to a man named Abraham. Now, we met Abraham for the first time last weekend in this series, and we meet him for the first time in the book of Genesis, in Genesis chapter 12, when God comes to Abraham kind of out of the blue. He introduces himself to Abraham, and he says, have I got a deal for you? I know you have a nice farm here, and I know you got a nice house, and I know you got a nice family. I want you to pack all of this up, and I want you to leave everything you've ever known, and I want you to take everything that you have, and I want you to go to a new place, a new land, a land that I will show you. You don't know where it is yet, but trust me, you'll like it once you get there. Now, Abraham, amazingly enough, after meeting God for the first time, actually believes in God and obeys God and packs up everything that he has and leaves everything that he's known, and he goes to this land that God wants to show to him. And this land is not too far from the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so now in Genesis 18, God comes back to Abraham again. And he says, so you've been watching these cities. I've been watching them too. And what's going on in these cities is really, really bad, and quite frankly, it's making me really, really mad. Here's what God says to Abraham, Genesis 18, verse 20, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin is so grievous, that I'm going to go down and I'm going to see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. I want you to put yourself in Abraham's shoes for just a second. Imagine that God came to you, and he had a complaint about these two cities. What would you do? I know what I'd do. I'd go to Sodom and Gomorrah and say, good luck, because I'd want to get out of the way. I wouldn't want to be anywhere near God and his wrath in these two cities. But that's not what Abraham does. That's not how Abraham responds. Instead of just getting out of the way, what Abraham does is he jumps into the fray. Because Abraham has something that he wants to say to God about these cities. Here's what he says, Genesis 18, verse 23. Abraham says to God, God, are you really going to sweep away the righteous with the wicked? I mean, come on. Sodom and Gomorrah can't be all bad, right? I mean, like, what if there were just 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of 50 righteous people in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing. That wouldn't be right. To kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. That's not fair. Far be it from you, Abraham says to God, will not the judge of the earth do right? Treat the righteous in a right way? The Lord thinks about it, and here's how he responds. He says, fine, if I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I'm going to spare the whole place, the whole city, for their sake. Now, I want to make sure you understand what's just happened in this little encounter and conversation. Abraham has just had an argument with God, and Abraham just won. An argument with God. Now again, put yourself in Abraham's shoes here for just a second. Imagine you had an argument with God and you won an argument with God. What would you do? You ever heard the old saying, quit while you're ahead? Because that's what I'd do. But that's not what Abraham does. Abraham doesn't quit while he's ahead. He goes back and he argues with God some more. Instead, Genesis 18, verse 27, Abraham speaks up again. And he says to God, okay, now that I've been so bold as to speak to the Lord, what if the number of the righteous is 5 less than 50? We'll just pull off 5. What if it's like 45 people in the city? Come on, God. You're not going to quibble over 5 people. Will you destroy the whole city for the lack of 5 people? To which God says, okay, fine. If I find 45 there, 45 righteous people, I will not destroy it. So Abraham argues with God again, and he wins an argument not once, but twice. Now you think that Abraham would take the win, but he goes back and he argues with God again. Verse 29, once again, Abraham spoke to God, what if only 40 are found there? To which God says, okay, fine. For the sake of 40, I will not do it. I won't destroy the cities. Now, it's at this point in Abraham's arguing with God that he begins to get a little bold, because Abraham has begun to realize something. The more that he argues, the more that God relents. And so Abraham's been subtracting by 5. Now he's going to start subtracting by 10. Verse 30. Then Abraham says, okay, well, let's knock 10 off of 40. What if only 30 can be found there? To which God answers, I won't destroy the cities if I find 30 people there. Abraham said, okay, well, what if only 20 can be found there? To which God says, for the sake of 20, I will not destroy it. And then Abraham said, may the Lord not be angry, but let me just speak one more time. And let's just cut the 20 in half. Let's make it 10. What if only 10 can be found there? To which God answers, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy the city. You know, the argument that Abraham has with God is both brave and brilliant. Here's why it's brave. It takes a lot of gumption to go to God and try to argue with God. I mean, Abraham had to be wondering, if I do this, what if God gets mad at me and not just Sodom and Gomorrah? How's that going to go? But it's also kind of brilliant. And here's the reason it's brilliant. It's spiritually and theologically brilliant. Because Abraham, for the first time in Scripture, is making a very specific argument. And here's the argument that he's making. He's saying to God, could it be true that the righteousness of just a few can somehow overwhelm, overcome, and undo the sinfulness of everybody else? In other words, Abraham says to God, God, based on the righteousness of just a few people, 50 people, 45 people, 40 people, 30 people, 20 people, 10 people, out of a city that is full of thousands of people, based on the righteousness of just a few, would you be willing to show mercy to a bunch of people who are sinful and messy? That's the question that Abraham is asking God. That's the argument that Abraham is making to God. Now, Abraham is being someone here. He's being an advocate. Because he's standing up for Sodom and Gomorrah when God wants to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. He's arguing for mercy for people who are messy. And that's what an advocate does. It stands up for people that nobody else wants to stand up for. An advocate argues for mercy when people are messy. Teachers, they can be incredible advocates, especially with certain kids. You know, the ones with learning gaps or the ones with behavior problems. Some teachers just have this natural knack and gift for seeing through that and seeing past that and speaking into that and blessing kids who struggle when everybody else looks at that kid and goes, they should be suspended. The teacher knows how to show mercy even when kids can get a little messy. Or you know how people can mess up their lives sometimes, right? They can make really dumb choices and really big mistakes that can blow up everything and everyone around them. Sometimes it's the financial choice that leads to bankruptcy, or the business choice that leads to you losing your job, or the relational choice that blows up the marriage. And when people make those kind of choices, something tends to happen. All of their friends flee. Because nobody wants to be around a person who's that messy. But every once in a while, there's one friend who stands by that dumb friend no matter what. Because they're an advocate. They show their friend mercy even when they've made mistakes and choices that make everything messy. In fact, here's the reality. I don't care who you are or how buttoned up, cleaned up, and spruced up your life looks. Everybody needs an advocate. Everybody needs someone who will show them mercy when their lives get messy. In fact, here's how deep this goes. There's another famous town, not as famous as Sodom and Gomorrah, but a famous town nonetheless. It's a biblical town. It's a town called Capernaum. It's a little fishing village on the northern edge of the Sea of Galilee. And Jesus actually had a special connection to and a special affection for this little town of Capernaum because this is where Jesus conducted his ministry out of. This was kind of the home base for his ministry operations. Now, you need to know this about Capernaum, just kind of on background. Capernaum and Sodom and Gomorrah were about as far away from each other, both like geographically and spiritually, as you could possibly ever hope to be. Because Capernaum, it was on kind of the northern edge of the region of Israel. Sodom and Gomorrah, it was south of the Dead Sea on the southern edge of the region of Israel. Sodom and Gomorrah, they were known for being metropolitan and cosmopolitan. In Genesis 18, some scholars think that these two cities contained as many as 50,000 people, which back then would have been a massive number of people, would have been equivalent to New York City in our day. And Sodom and Gomorrah prided themselves on being culturally smart and not falling for moral shackles and statutes and strictures, being free in whatever they wanted to do. They did not pride themselves on being culturally conservative. They prided themselves on being enlightened and progressive. Now, when it comes to Capernaum, they were pretty much the exact opposite spiritually. They were Jewish. They were family-oriented. They still believed in the Ten Commandments. They still believed in morality. They still believed in traditionality. And so these two cities could not have been more far apart culturally, spiritually, geographically. And yet it's so interesting because in Matthew 11, Jesus is talking about some cities in his region. And one of the cities that he singles out is the city of Capernaum. And Jesus says in Matthew 11, verse 23, Capernaum, are you going to be lifted up to the heavens? Because by all accounts, they probably should have been. They were a good little fishing village with good morals and good people. But Jesus says, actually, no. You're going to go down to Hades. Now, just so you know what that means, Hades is a title for hell. And so Jesus looks at these people from Capernaum, and here's what he says to them. You're going to hell. Anybody want to be on the receiving end of that sermon from Jesus? I mean, really? Jesus continues, if the miracles that were performed in you had been performed in Sodom, it would have remained to this day. In other words, Sodom, in some ways, spiritually, was probably a little bit more attuned to what God was doing than you are. But I tell you, verse 24, that it's going to be more bearable for Sodom on the day of judgment than for you. Because when it comes to your sinfulness, you're not as good as you think you are. You're not as great as you believe yourselves to be. Now, for anybody listening to Jesus at this moment in this message, they would have been shocked, appalled, quite frankly, infuriated, angered. Because they would have been thinking to themselves, come on now, we may not be perfect, but we're not Sodom. We're like Jewish and righteous. Not Sodom and sinful. But for anybody who's willing to listen, Jesus has something very important that he's trying to say, albeit in a very kind of punchy way. Here's what Jesus is trying to say. You can fall prey to the sin of Sodom in one of two ways. Sometimes, here's how you can fall prey to the sin of Sodom. You can go and you can live in Sodom. And you can buy into all of their cultural mores and all of their cultural values, all of their, cultural lack of values. And you can say, I'm enlightened and I'm free and I'm modern and I don't need traditional morality. I'm past all that and I'm cool. To which Jesus would say, no, you're not. You're just a fool. You don't want to go live in Sodom because it'll destroy you. That's one way that you can fall prey to the sin of Sodom. But here's the other way that you can fall prey to the sin of Sodom. As it turns out, sometimes not only can you go to live in Sodom, Sodom can actually come to live in you. And that's what was going on in Capernaum. All the stuff that Sodom was doing, people in Capernaum struggled with it too. They were just better at hiding it. Is that true for you? Back to that sin list in Ezekiel 16. Ezekiel 16, verse 49, the prophet says, this was the sin of Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant. You ever been arrogant? Just curious. You ever been a little proud? Maybe that you're not as bad as the people of Sodom? I don't know. Sodom was overfed. You ever been overfed? Too much food, too much drink, gluttony. Maybe it's not so much food you gorge yourself on or drink that you drink too much of. Maybe it's, entertainment that you gorge yourself on, or maybe you always got to get the latest, new, really expensive toy. Sodom, Ezekiel says, was unconcerned about her sin. You ever been unconcerned about your sin? Here's the way that we're usually unconcerned about our sin. We tend to like to make excuses for it and downplay it. There was this old Puritan preacher from the 1600s. His name was Thomas Brooks, and I love the way that he put it. He said that people are really good at taking vices and painting them in virtue's colors. In other words, people will say, well, no, come on now. I'm not proud. I just have a lot of self-confidence. Or, I'm not really greedy. I'm just thrifty. You ever make excuses for your sin like that? Ezekiel says that when it comes to Sodom, they did not help the poor and the needy. Have you ever been greedy rather than generous? And they were haughty, and they did detestable things. Now, remember that phrase, detestable things? It's a euphemism or an idiom biblically for sexual sin. You ever struggle with sexual sin, like lust even just a little bit? Where you look at that picture you know you shouldn't be looking at, or maybe your eyes linger on that one person that you see just a little too long? It turns out the problem with Sodom is not just that we can go and live there, it's that it can come and live in us. Which is why everybody needs an advocate. Because sooner or later, because of our mistakes and our poor choices and our sin, life is going to get messy, and we need someone to show up and offer us mercy. Which actually is what makes this story from Genesis 18 so terrifying. If you really read it, it's terrifying. Not just because of ancient cities that were bad, but because of modern people who still struggle. Because Abraham gives it its best shot, right? He really does. He goes to God and he says, hey, do you think that you can show these people who are messy mercy? He tries to be an advocate. He tries to stand up for Sodom and Gomorrah. What happens to Sodom and Gomorrah? Does anybody remember the rest of the story? It's pretty famous. And it ain't good. Abraham makes this big argument in Genesis 18. God, can you spare these people? Can you show them mercy? By Genesis 19, verse 24, here's how Sodom and Gomorrah's story ends. The Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah. It turns out that Abraham tries to be an advocate, but his advocacy doesn't quite work. Perhaps we ought to ask the question, why? Because if you're messy, you probably want mercy, so you probably want an advocate that could get the job done, and Abraham doesn't quite get the job done. And so here's what I want to do. Let's just do a little post-mortem on Abraham's argument. A little autopsy on what Abraham has to say to God. Because one of the things that I've always found fascinating about Abraham's argument with God is that he makes the argument, but then he doesn't take the argument all the way to its logical conclusion. Because remember Abraham's basic argument. He says to God, could it be true that based on the righteousness of just a few, sin itself could be overwhelmed, overcome, and undone? Could that be true? Could it be true that based on the righteousness of just a few, you would show a whole bunch of people mercy? That's Abraham's argument. And Abraham makes it again and again and again. Based on the righteousness of 50, could you do that? God says yes. Based on the righteousness of 45, could you do that? God says yes. Based on the righteousness of 40, could you do that? God says yes. Based on the righteousness of 30, could you do that? God says yes. Based on the righteousness of 20, could you do that? God says yes. Based on the righteousness of 10, could you do that? And God says yes. You know what happens next in the story? Here's what happens next in the story. Genesis 18, verse 33, Abraham goes home. Now, I don't know. Maybe Abraham kind of thought, okay, there are 10 righteous people in the city. It's not going to be a problem. Maybe Abraham just overestimated the righteousness of Sodom and Gomorrah. Maybe it was just an honest mistake. But we should at least ask the question. Is there any argument that Abraham could have made that would save these cities? I mean, what if Abraham would have kept on going? God, I know I told you 10 was going to be my lowest number, but can I just cut that in half again? 5. Could the righteousness of 5 people somehow overwhelm, overcome, and undo the sinfulness of everybody else? Based on the righteousness of 5 people, would you show everybody else in those cities mercy even though they're messy? Or how about 3? Could the righteousness of just 3 people somehow overwhelm, overcome, and undo the sinfulness of everybody else? Based on the righteousness of just 3, could you show everybody else mercy, even though those towns are really messy? Or I suppose we should take it to its logical conclusion. How about 1? Could it be true that based on the righteousness of just 1 person, sin itself could be overwhelmed, overcome, and undone? Based on the righteousness of just 1, might it be that God would show everybody else lots of mercy, even though they're sinful, broken, messed up, and messy? Could God do that? You know, maybe the fatal flaw in Abraham's argument was this. Abraham was looking for the righteousness of some, when all he really needed was the righteousness of one. So there's this guy, his name is John, and John was one of the 12 disciples of Jesus. And John was actually one of the closest of the 12 disciples of Jesus. And John, real late in his life, he writes these 3 little letters. We actually have them in the back of our New Testament as 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John. And he's just writing to people who are a lot younger than him by this point about what he saw in Jesus, about what he heard from Jesus, about what he learned from Jesus. And there's this great line in 1 John 2, verse 1, where John says, "Dear children," and of course he calls them children because, he's older than all of them. They could be his kids, his grandkids, his great-grandkids. He says, "Dear children, I'm writing to you so that you do not sin," because John doesn't want people to sin. He doesn't want people to move to Sodom, and he doesn't want Sodom to move into them. He's big on that. But then he continues and he says, "But just in case you do, just in case you do sin, I want you to know something. You have an advocate. You have someone who will stand up for you when things get messy. And he will offer you mercy right there in front of God the Father." Who's the advocate? Jesus Christ. And here's the great thing about Jesus. With Jesus, you don't need the righteousness of some. 50, 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. You know why? Because he's the righteous what? One. And one is all you need. As it turns out, it's true. The righteousness of just one man can overcome, overwhelm, and undo the sinfulness of everybody else. So here's the most important question I can ask you. Who's your one? Who's your one? Who's your advocate? You want to get that right, okay? Because that's the warning of Sodom and Gomorrah. You get the advocacy thing wrong and you get fire and brimstone. That ain't good. But when Jesus is your one, instead of fire, you get forgiveness. And instead of brimstone, you get a stone that has been rolled away, which is why for 2,000 years now, the church has stood up to say, Jesus is my advocate. He's my one. And you know what? Everybody needs an advocate.